So this week we are doing something a little different. We are joining you from Minnesota. I'm up here visiting Grace's sister and her brother-in-law, and it is absolutely gorgeous here in lovely Minnesota. But I'm not doing this in front of the group. We're going to come to you today via recording, and I really think this is one of those subjects that if you can get your arms around what we're going to talk about today, it could really change your whole entire approach, maybe even to Christianity, but certainly as it relates to this issue of what is a steward and really what that whole concept is all about. Stewardship is really something that most people don't really understand. For the average person, when they think of this idea of stewardship, they think of money. Frankly, am I giving money to the church? In fact, we actually call that, a good stewardship would be, how much money are you tithing? And yes, there's certainly that element to it, but that's clearly not what Paul is talking about here in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. Before we get too far along, let's read what it says here in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We'll read the first 4 verses. It says, "Let a man regard us in this manner, as servants of Christ." That's the word hepeperes, which we talked about last week, is the word under rowers. Let a man regard us in this manner, as under rowers of Christ, servants of Christ, and stewards of the mysteries of God. In this case, moreover, it is required of stewards that one be found faithful or trustworthy. But to me, it is a very small thing that I should be examined by you or by any human court. In fact, I don't even examine myself, for I am conscious of nothing against myself, yet I am not by this acquitted, but the one who examines me is the Lord. So what Paul is talking about here is he's saying, look, you have to understand how people view you. And the way in which people view you or regard you, or actually the literal word there is reckon, the people that actually reckon you or how they regard you is really important. Now, of course, the thing that we talked about last week was the Corinthians viewed themselves as superior. In verse 7 it says, "For who regards you as superior, and what do you have that you did not receive? But if you didn't receive it, why do you boast as if you have not received it?" So in other words, they're saying, what Paul is saying is, look, don't consider yourself to be something special when you're really not very special. The truth is, you're just nothing more than under rowers for Christ. You are the people at the base of the ship that make this thing go, but you're not the captain of the ship. That's Jesus, and that's where we need to be viewing it. And the other thing that we have to recognize is that we are not only under rowers, we talked about that last week, but we are stewards of the mysteries of God. Indeed, what Paul is saying here, look, is he cares deeply about how the outside world regards or reckons the church. And he uses this word logizomai, which means to reckon or value or esteem, a great deal in his writings. He uses it throughout the entire book of Romans. It's amazing how many times he uses it there. He uses it in Romans chapter 4, for example, when he talks about Abraham. He says that Abraham's was not, that his works were not what reckoned him or regarded him for righteousness. He uses it in Romans chapter 8, when he's talking about the Spirit of God and the fact that nothing can separate us from God. And he says, "For your sake are you put to death all the day long. We are reckoned or considered as sheep going to the slaughterhouse." And in 2 Corinthians he says, "For if I do wish to boast, I shall not be foolish, for I would be speaking the truth. But I refrain from this, so that no man may regard or reckon me with more than what he sees or hears from me." So Paul pays very close attention to this idea of how people regard you. In fact, he uses logizomai 38 different times in his writings. In fact, all of the other New Testament writers use the word but 6 times. He uses it 38 times, and obviously there are all sorts of different places you can look to to see that, but especially in the book of, as I said, in the book of Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians. So how people view us as believers is something that we need to pay very special attention to. When people think of you, do they think of you as a servant of God first? Or do they think of you in another way? Do they think of you as, hey, that really great guy that, has that business down the street? Or do they think of you as somebody that, is, somebody we can just go and talk to or whatever? And that's all good. I'm not suggesting there's anything wrong with any of that. But first and foremost, they should view you as a servant of Christ and as a steward of his mysteries. And I think that's all that really matters. Are you doing what Paul is suggesting? When they think of you, do they think of you as the person that makes the church go? That would be the under-rower. Do they think of you as somebody that they can go to if they have a question about God? That's a person I would go and talk to. Is that what they think of you? Because if it is, then you're really in line with what Paul is telling us here in 1 Corinthians. But if it's not, then it's something that you need to pay very close attention to and see if maybe you can get this straightened out. So what is a steward? And moreover, what is a steward of God's mysteries? Well, to understand what a steward is really someone who manages the household of another person, usually their master, yet he himself really owns nothing. I think the best example I can think of is a butler of the castle of a lord in England. A servant or a steward is someone who takes care of the household of another. He manages those affairs, and the key to this whole entire thing is that he does it faithfully, that he does it trustworthily. If you think about it, the butler paid all the bills. He hired the staff. He basically ran the house on behalf of the Lord. And in English, the word steward is made up of two words, made up of the word stew and ward. And stew is an interesting word because that's all of the articles of a kitchen. So when you make a stew, basically you throw all the potatoes in and you throw all the carrots and celery and all those vegetables, and you take any kind of meat you have, and you might even mix meats in a stew. You might have lamb, and you might have beef, you might have venison. You could just about have any kind of thing in there at all. So the idea of a stew was basically all the things that were going on within the household. A ward was the area of fortification in a castle, and it's been carried over into a lot of different thoughts. For example, in the hospital, we talk about the place where people are protected and cared for as the ward. In the Mormon church, for example, they talk about the actual place where you go to meet and have your fellowship as a ward, a place of fortification, a place of safety. For example, if you are a ward of the state, using it as a noun, you're a person that's protected by the state. So a steward was the one who was responsible for the keeping or the safekeeping of everything in the Lord's house. But a steward is more about protecting the assets of one's Lord. And that's certainly the case here. Men ought to regard us not only as under-rowers, but stewards or keepers of the mysteries of God. And we're going to talk about that in a second, this idea of the mysteries of God. But the single most important trait of stewards is that they be found trustworthy. Now, I want you to think about that in terms of maybe like a butler in England. If you had a person that was acting as a steward in your home, and that person were to steal from you, that was punishable by death. That was not something they took lightly back in those days. We certainly can see the idea that moreover is it required of stewards that they be found faithful, that they be found trustworthy. And in verses 3 and 4, Paul actually expands on that by saying that, look, I don't care if you judge me, I don't care if a court judges me, I know what I'm all about. And the truth is, the only person that really knows everything about me is of course the Lord, or maybe even myself. But here's what Paul is talking about. He's saying that I only care about one thing. I only care about pleasing God. And that's what a steward is. A steward is someone that just takes care of the affairs of his Lord and does not have any ownership himself. That's so important that you understand. There is no ownership himself. And that's why, for example, in my radio show for years, I've always called it God's money, because it's not our money. It's God's money. It's not our home. It's God's. We come into this world with nothing. We leave with nothing. If you hear those birds in the background, that's because I'm outside here. It's beautiful here in Minnesota today, probably about 70 degrees, and the birds are singing, and it's it's just lovely. So what does it mean, or what does it mean to be a steward of the mysteries of God? The mysteries of God are those things that God has revealed to believers that the world just simply doesn't get, that the world does not understand. Earlier in chapter 2, Paul said this, as he was writing, he said, the natural man does not accept the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him. He cannot even understand them because they're spiritually understood. We have to understand ourselves more than any other thing that we have been given the mysteries of God, the things that men do not get. We have been given those things as a gift. We have this gracious God that we stand before and we serve has given all of his great teachings to us. He's given us the Word of God. And that Word of God stands heads and shoulders above any other book that has ever been written. He's given us these mysteries, these words, so that we can share them with other people, so that we can take those mysteries and we can actually allow other people to come to a place where they understand them as well. But it is not something that happens because of me doing it or you doing it. It's simply because God does it. Remember earlier on, he says, Apollos planted, I watered, but it is God that gives the increase. The mystery of God is that he does all the work. We just merely plant. And if you think about it, I'm up here in Minnesota right now, and there are cornfields everywhere around here. There's just one cornfield after another cornfield after another cornfield. And the one thing every farmer will tell you is that they have nothing to do with the seed. They just merely plant the seed. They didn't invent the seed. The seed came to them via a prior crop. So the seed is something they had nothing to do with. They plant that seed. They then put dirt over it, and they don't do anything. And a couple of weeks later, we start seeing sprouts, and we start seeing things start to grow out of the ground. They had nothing to do with that. That was done by God. God's the one that brings those things out. And of course, they get to a certain height. They start to get a little hairy at the top, and then they start shooting off corn. One farmer plants, another waters, but it is God that causes those plants to grow. And of course, that's the same here. The mysteries of God are so interesting because they're the difference between us and everyone else. The fact is that most people do not understand the mysteries of God, do not believe the mysteries of God, do not accept the mysteries of God, do not even begin to get what God is talking about when he talks about the mysteries of God. And I think Isaiah says it best. He says, for my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are my ways your ways, saith the Lord. Our thoughts are not God's thoughts. Our ways are not God's ways. And if you think about it, that makes perfect sense because God is an infinite God. We are finite people. His thoughts can't be what our thoughts are. His ways can't be what our ways are. So as we get into this, I think one of the easiest places to identify the mysteries of God is to go back to the book of Romans and look at what Paul says there about the plan of God, about the gospel of God. He starts it off by saying, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone that believes, to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. So he's giving us a gospel. What is a gospel? A gospel is the good news. It's a message. It's the message of God to mankind. And that gospel differentiates itself from everything that man likes to teach. The first thing that he says is that God is the creator. and that God is above all things, that everything that we see was created by God. As I look out here at this beautiful field up here in Minnesota, I'm just fascinated by all the things that I see, and the birds that are flying, and the beautiful breeze that's coming out of the northwest right now. And I sit here and I think to myself, this is the mystery of God. Just, it's all around me, this beautiful creation. But man doesn't believe that. Man believes that all of this was somehow brought to us by some sort of an evolution, where one thing sort of got better, and the next thing got better and got bigger, and so forth and so on. And it also says in Romans that God is above all things, that God is the ruler of the universe, that he runs all things. Man, of course, doesn't really buy into that whole concept. The idea of man is that God, if there was a God, kind of set this all in motion, but now it's up to us to take care of this whole entire thing. The second thing he says is that God, and this is another great mystery, God is totally impartial. Even though he at one time picked people Israel above all other nations to be his select people, he did that for a specific reason, and that was to show them that they needed a sacrifice, that they needed salvation. And that's a mystery of God as well, the need for salvation. What God says here, or what Paul says to us about God, is that he's totally impartial, that God does not regard one person above another, that he regards all of us in the exact same way. Jew, Gentile, bond, free, woman, man, doesn't make any difference. God regards us all in the same way as to our need for him. And so when it talks about our need for him, the mystery is that God does not regard one person as being better than the other. Now, of course, man totally regards people as being one being better than the other. We have all sorts of tiers that we've placed into our society. We even have these things which we call classes. You know, we have the upper class and the middle class and the lower class and the poor and so on. These are distinctions that men make about other men. God doesn't do that. He's totally and completely impartial. The mystery of God is that he does not view us as being different as far as our availability of his gospel, of his message. The third thing that the book of Romans tells us is that there's no one righteous. No, not one. There's not one person that on his own merit can find his way to any kind of relationship with God. That the only way that you can have a relationship with God and find favor with God is faith in the plan of God. That's it. Man really thinks that, look, if I do enough good things, I'm going to be okay with God, if there even is a God. And again, it comes right back to that, if there even is a God. Because the mystery of God is that he exists. The greatest mystery of God is that he is active, and he is working right now, and he has not changed. He has not gone the way of men, where we're constantly changing, where we think that we come up with a better mousetrap, as it were. It's not the case. The Bible is very, very clear in its teaching about that mystery, that God does not change. The fourth thing that the book of Romans tells us is that all salvation from sin comes exclusively through the sacrifice of Jesus Christ, and that only through faith in Jesus Christ can you be saved. Well, of course, the world teaches us, look, there's many ways to God. You can go to God through this religion or this other way, or even outside of religion. You don't even need any kind of organized religion whatsoever. You can just come to God any way you so feel is important. God is loving, and so therefore he would accept us as long as we're good enough, and as long as we don't do anything really, really horrible. Christ alone is just a foreign concept. This idea that salvation comes through him and through him only is not something that the world ever wants to hear. You know, Jesus said it this way. He said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man comes to the Father but through me. But that's the mystery of God. But those that are not believers would say, well, are you kidding me? The only way is through Christ? Well, what happens to those people that never even heard the message of Christ, and so on? So there's always this conflict that goes on in the minds of people, and it's because my thoughts are not your thoughts, saith the Lord, neither are my ways your ways. Furthermore, he goes on to say that justification, being made righteous, comes only by faith and faith alone, and that faith alone is what brings peace with God. Most of the world doesn't even think about peace with God. They don't even go there. They don't even think about the fact that they even have a need for justification. Why would I need to be justified? I haven't done anything that got me arrested. I haven't done anything that's too evil. The truth of the matter is, as I was sharing with my brother-in-law Bob yesterday, most of the world really is pretty well behaved. Most of the world is not out there killing people. Most of the world is totally offended by that. Most of the world wants to see people do things right and wants to see things done in a kind and compassionate way. I really believe that with all my heart. But that does not mean that they are without need of justification. You see, if you constantly believe that what you do is going to get you to a relationship with God, then you don't understand the mysteries of God. The mysteries of God say there's nothing that we can do that can please Him except believe Him. And that, to me, is really just an amazing thing. He goes on to say that believers have a challenge with sin. It says, first and foremost, that we're dead to sin, but alive unto God, but that we've got this challenge of a conflict within us, because within every single one of us is this thing which we call the flesh, or the human side of us. And the flesh, this human nature, has a very major conflict with the spiritual nature that God has implanted in each and every one of us who believe. And that, to me, is the greatest mystery. The greatest mystery of God is that He comes to dwell within men. And He comes to dwell within us in such a way that we actually believe Him. And when I look at this thing, I say to myself, wow, I've got this conflict going on within me. And I see it. Every one of us sees it. Believe me, I am a testimony to Romans chapter 7 when it says the things that I want to do, those are the things I find myself not doing, and the things that I don't do are the things that I should be doing. So here's the great battle that goes on within every single person who is in fact a believer. And the great mystery of God is that He's given us an answer to deal with this conflicting nature that is within each one of us, the human nature and the spiritual nature, and that is the fact that He puts His Spirit within us and indwells Himself within us. Above anything else, the one mystery that separates the world from those who believe is that God is active in our lives. That is something that the world just does not get. It is a foreign concept. This concept that God Himself would come and dwell within every single one of us is a foreign concept. How do you treat the mysteries of God? Do you treat them as a steward? Do you treat them as one who honors and keeps them faithfully regardless of what those outside of the castle feel about the Lord of that castle? Or do you treat them as an outsider, as somebody that looks at these things and goes, I just don't get it. I just don't get it. Because if that's the case, you know what? Even today, you can make a change in your life. You can say, you know what? I really want to be a person that understands the mysteries of God and accepts those mysteries as mine, and receive Jesus Christ today as your Savior. It's as simple as just praying and asking God to come into your life and to make that a reality. How do you treat what God has done? How do you treat the revelation that Jesus Christ alone has come to save you, to sacrifice Himself for you? Because in the end, that is the only thing and the only question that you'll ever need to answer. Hey, we'll see you next week. We'll get into the balance of this chapter. We'll be doing it live back in Stuart and, at TC3, and so we're excited about being able to do that. And I hope you guys have a great week.